Last time we covered what is called the Classical Era, which is about 600 BC through 600 AD. Also, just think of it as ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Today we are covering what took place after the fall of Rome, leading up to the modern era, which starts around the year 1200. So remember, when Rome fell, it wasn't the entire Roman Empire. It was only the western half of the Roman Empire that fell. Remember, Constantine had moved the headquarters of the Roman Empire from the city of Rome to the city of Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. And when he did that, moved from Rome here to Constantinople here, the western half of the Roman Empire continued to get weaker, and the eastern half stayed strong. So in 476, the barbarians conquered the western half of the Roman Empire, but the eastern half remained. And in fact, it remained for about another 1,000 years. And we call this era the time of the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine Empire, named after the city of Byzantium, since Rome is no longer a part of it. This remained a very strong Christian kingdom from the fall of Rome in 476 until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So about 1,000 years, you have the Byzantine Empire remaining a strong force. And the borders were constantly shifting, as you see in the map there. At one point, it was very large, encompassing most of what the Roman Empire had previously held. And at other times, it was very small, only encompassing the parts that you see in the dark red there. And the reasons why the borders were constantly shifting in the Byzantine Empire is because of conflicts with Europeans to the west and conflicts with Muslims to the east, which we will get into later. The long unified Christian church, the church that started in the first century, that had been unified for a very long time, experienced a schism in 1054, the Great Schism it's known as, where the church split into two denominations. Now, these days, there are hundreds of different denominations. You can see all sorts of different types of Christian churches all over the place. But it used to be that there was only one form of Christianity. And in 1054, the church split into the Roman Catholic Church in the west and the Eastern Orthodox Church in the east. Now, the Byzantines played a major role in medieval history. Medieval history is seen as the Middle Ages, the time between the fall of Rome and the beginning of the Renaissance. They were a major power during that entire time. They also played a big role in the Silk Roads trade, which we'll get to later, as well as the Crusades. So speaking of the Crusades, what is Islam? Now, before Islam, the world's monotheistic religions were Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism. Remember, monotheism means that you believe there is only one God. Polytheism means you believe there are many gods. So we've talked about Hinduism, that is a polytheistic faith. Judaism and Christianity are monotheistic faiths because they only believe in one God. Zoroastrianism, we haven't talked about much. It doesn't really exist anymore, but it was an ancient Persian religion, only believed in one God, and it focused a lot on the concepts of free will and the eternal fight between good and evil. So that is what the Middle East was mostly comprised of before Islam began in the year 610. It was mostly Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, as well as some animist and tribal religions throughout. And in the year 610, a man named Muhammad founded the religion of Islam. So he was from Arabia. He was born in the city of Mecca and then later moved to Medina to found this religion. And he claimed that he had been given a vision from God and that it was his task to, quote, restore God's people to once again worshiping the one true God, Allah. So Muhammad said that God told him that Christians and Jews had lost their way and they weren't worshiping the true God, and that Allah is the one true God, and that it was Muhammad's task to spread that message as much as he could. Now, Islam has 5 aspects to it, or 5 pillars as they are called. Basically, these are the 5 things that good Muslims are supposed to do in order to get to heaven. And this would be prayer, pilgrimage, alms, fasting, and faith. Okay, prayer, that is the idea that you should pray 5 times a day, usually on a prayer mat facing the city of Mecca. And this should be done at certain hours of the day when you pray to Allah. A pilgrimage, that is a religious journey of some sort, and Muslims are expected to take a pilgrimage at least once in their life to the city of Mecca in order to earn salvation. Alms, that means giving to the poor. Fasting, that means going without food for a long period of time. There's a holy season in Islam called Ramadan, where people are supposed to fast. And then finally, faith, belief in the holy writings of Islam and belief in Allah. So the community of Islam became a nation with Muhammad as its leader, and it spread Islam all throughout Arabia, the places you see in the map there, and they did this through military conquest. In addition to being a religious founder, a religious leader, Muhammad was also a military general, and he said the best way to spread the faith would be through military conquest. Now, Muhammad's teachings were later written down in a book known as the Quran. It can also be spelled with a Q, Q-U-R-A-N, or spelled with a K like I have it on the screen there. And the Quran is still seen as the holy book of Islam, and good Muslims are expected to only read it in its original Arabic. Now, after Muhammad died in 632, there was a split that took place in the religion of Islam. This was kind of similar to the split that took place in Christianity later on, but this took place in the 600s, and it happened because Muslims disagreed on who should be the next leader of the community of Islam now that Muhammad was dead. He didn't have a son, but he had a son-in-law, and he had a father-in-law. And people kind of broke off into camps in that way, and those who believed that his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, should be the next leader, they became known as Sunni Muslims. And those who believed that his son-in-law, Ali, should become the next ruler, they became known as Shia Muslims. And this division still exists today. As you see in the bottom picture there, the area in the light green, those are the parts of the Middle East that are majority Sunni. That's about 80% of Muslims. And then the dark green is Shia majority areas, and that is about 20% of the Muslim world. So Abu Bakr, Ali, and other caliphs, which was their word for leaders, they waged a holy war to spread the Islamic Empire beyond Arabia. So looking at the top map there, the area in the brown, this is the area that the community of Islam had conquered before the death of Muhammad. And then looking at the orange, this is the expansion that took place of the Islamic world under Abu Bakr. So Abu Bakr was the first caliph or leader after Muhammad's death, and through military conquest, he was able to spread the Islamic Empire to all of those regions that are still today the Islamic world. So this concept of holy war, waging a war for the glory of, in this case, Allah, is known as jihad. This is a term in the Quran, and the term jihad is really the reason why the religion of Islam is controversial today. A lot of people, when they hear about Muslims or Islam, immediately their mind goes to terrorism. But the reason why some Muslims engage in terrorism is because of the idea of jihad. Now, the majority of Muslims are peaceful people because they interpret this idea of jihad, which literally translates as struggle. They interpret this as an inner struggle, that you should fight an inner struggle with yourself to be the best Muslim you can be, and therefore the majority of Muslims are peaceful. But the minority of Muslims interpret jihad literally as a command from Allah to wage war, to kill all people who won't convert to Islam, and to expand Allah's kingdom in that way. So that's why there's the split between radical Muslims and the majority of Muslims who are peaceful. So jihad is the way that Islam spread, and by the end of the 700s, the caliphate had spread all across the Middle East, all across North Africa, and into southwestern Europe, modern-day Spain and Portugal. And this entire territory became known as Dar al-Islam, which literally means the House of Islam or everywhere Islam is. We might just say the Islamic world. So when you hear that term Dar al-Islam, that just means the Islamic world, Muslim majority countries. Now, for centuries, Muslims were constantly at war on the borders of Dar al-Islam, trying to extend Islam further. And this brought about conflict with Christians because, as you see, the Islamic Empire is on the border of the Byzantine Empire, which is Christian, and it's on the border of the Frankish kingdom over here, which is also Christian because it's in Europe. So they had a lot of conflicts with Christians. They also had a lot of conflicts with Hindus because you see over here, they expanded into the borders of India and came across Hindus. This is also the Christian and Jewish Holy Land that was taken over by Abu Bakr in the 600s. And so there was a lot of conflict with Jewish people too. And then you can't overlook the fact that Muslims did fight other Muslims, usually Sunnis versus Shias, or one Muslim empire versus another Muslim empire. So it was a time of constant conflict. Now, the largest and most influential nation in Dar al-Islam during the Postclassical era was the Abbasid caliphate. So caliphate, that's where we get the term caliph. So a caliph is a leader. A kingdom is where you have a king. A caliphate is where you have a caliph. All right. So the Abbasid caliphate existed from the 700s until the 1200s. And it was a thriving nation that was really at the center of all three major trade routes in Afro-Eurasia. And those three major trade routes were the Indian Ocean trade, which took place right around here, as you see in the turquoise. That is the Abbasid Caliphate. So they were on the border of this trade route. They also were a part of the Silk Road, which went across Asia and cut through here. And they were a part of the Trans-Saharan trade, which went across the Sahara Desert into sub-Saharan Africa. And as you see, they were a part of that too. So they thrived economically because of their position at really the crossroads of the world, the crossroads of Afro-Eurasia, where everyone comes together. The capital city of the Abbasid Caliphate was Baghdad. That's the modern-day capital of Iraq. And Baghdad was the intellectual center of the world at the time, much like Athens was the intellectual center of the classical era. Baghdad was the intellectual center of the post-classical era. There were a ton of advancements that were made in different academic subjects. For example, there were advances in medicine that were made by the Abbasids, astronomy, mathematics. For example, the Arabic numerals that we still use today, that was based on the numbers that were formed in the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasids also invented algebra. Greek and Roman texts were copied and preserved during this time where a lot of Europe was in the Middle Ages and literacy was fairly low. The Abbasids had a very high value on literacy and were copying and preserving ancient Greek and Roman texts. By the way, the Irish were doing the same thing at the time. Since the Irish were never conquered by the Romans, that means they weren't conquered by the barbarians when they took over Rome. And so while the former Roman Empire was kind of miring in the Dark Ages and education was very low, in Ireland, that was not the case. They were copying and preserving ancient Greek and Roman texts, much like the Abbasids were doing on the other side of Europe. The House of Wisdom was the university in Baghdad, one of the great universities of the medieval world, and this included a huge library that belonged to the Abbasid caliphs. Now moving to post-classical India and Southeast Asia. So looking at the map there, India, that's a religious map. India is still mostly Hindu, and yet Islam is very much coming in at the border of northern India. So from 600 to 1200, South Asia, which is more commonly known as India, was in a constant state of both religious and political conflict. It was a very disunited region, did not have a lot of tranquility or unity, and yet they still were able to make a lot of advancements in trade through the Indian Ocean. So we talked about the Indian Ocean trade. Just to recap those trade routes again, the Silk Road went across Asia like this, and the Indian Ocean trade was around here. As you see, India is right in the middle of that, and they were able to make a lot of advancements in trade throughout the Indian Ocean. Religiously, both Hinduism and Buddhism spread from India into Southeast Asia. So looking here, Hinduism traveled into Southeast Asia, as did Buddhism. This region right here is Southeast Asia. As you see, Islam spread into Southeast Asia too, mostly in the region that we now call Indonesia, but at the time was known as the Spice Islands. Islam spread from the Middle East to Southeast Asia and to northern India, and conflict with Hindus was constant. Both trade and religious division really mark this era for South and Southeast Asia. Those are the major things to remember about this time and place. Now getting to post-classical China and Japan. In China, the Sui dynasty and the Tang dynasty were the powers of this time. They built a lot of infrastructure. They really strengthened the economy in that way. One of the things they built was the Grand Canal that connected the Chinese rivers that flowed east to west. The Grand Canal went north to south to really connect that and expand trade within China. The country was much more united. The borders were expanded during the time of the Sui and Tang dynasties. Also during this time, China held the secrets of both silk and gunpowder. They invented silk through silkworms, but nobody knew how they made silk. Everyone else just knew that silk was pretty and it felt nice and it was a status symbol and it was elegant, and so they wanted it, but they didn't know how to make it. So that meant that the Chinese had a monopoly on the market. They controlled the entire market, and therefore they could charge whatever they wanted and sell as much silk as they could produce. They also held the secret of gunpowder for a very long time. The Chinese were the only ones who knew how to make gunpowder. Eventually, of course, the secret got out, and gunpowder spread throughout Afro-Eurasia and completely transformed warfare. The Chinese considered themselves to be the Middle Kingdom, and this essentially meant that they were at the center of the world. And the reason they believed this was because they were the largest empire as far as population goes. They had something like 25 to 40% of the world's population lived within China. And because they were very strong and very large, they forced neighboring nations to pay them tribute. Tribute is basically something that you pay a larger, stronger country in order to get good graces and get their protection, and in exchange for a promise that they won't invade you. Now, the Song dynasty is the first dynasty talked about in the AP World History curriculum. There are 4 dynasties mentioned in the AP World History curriculum, and the one from the Postclassical era coming into the 1200s is the Song dynasty. Now, the Song dynasty continued China's golden age, as it's known, with increased manufacturing and increased trade. Now getting to Japan, which is off the coast of China, from 800 to 1200, Japan had a golden age of its own, specifically a golden age of art and literature. So something to really keep in mind is, though we call this time period the Dark Ages for Europe, it was not really the Dark Ages for the entire world. The Abbasid caliphate had a lot of intellectual advancements. The Chinese and the Japanese had a lot of advancements in art and literature and infrastructure and manufacturing. And so just keep in mind that the different regions of the world were experiencing this era in very different ways. The imperial government of Japan fractured at some point in this era and became very decentralized. A decentralized government is when one governmental force doesn't control a large area, but is very chaotic and kind of fractured into different sovereignties. And warfare ensued because of this. Japan entered a very long, dark period of civil war, and the people who led these wars were the shoguns and the daimyos. The shoguns were the military generals, the people who the samurai worked for, and the daimyos were the landowners, and they really fought for power. The people with the military might behind them and the people who owned the land were constantly fighting for power. Now, religiously, Shinto was Japan's major religion. The 2 main aspects of Shintoism is ancestor veneration So, really revering your deceased ancestors and looking to them for wisdom, as well as worship of nature spirits. So, it's very similar to animism in that way. And then post-classical Europe. Well, the Byzantines were very much flourishing in Eastern Europe. On the map there, they are in the baby blue. But while they were really prospering in Eastern Europe, Western Europe was kind of in disarray for centuries after the fall of Rome. This all changed around the year 800 when the French king Charlemagne founded the Holy Roman Empire. And this empire lasted from 800 to 1806 until it was conquered by Napoleon, something we'll get to way later. And the reason why Charlemagne and others wanted to establish this empire was to try to bring back the glory of the former Roman Empire. Now, it was never nearly as powerful or large as the ancient Roman Empire was, but they called themselves the Holy Roman Empire. And this brought strength, brought unity, and brought cultural exchange back to Western Europe. This happened gradually, but over time they started to become more well-connected, more educated, more prosperous than they were at the beginning of this time period of the post-classical era. The Vikings were a major player in European relations during the post-classical era. They existed from around 800 to 1200, and they were Norse seafarers. Norse means they were from this area of Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and they were seafarers. They were basically pirates. They ravaged ships, they ravaged coastal cities, they killed, they robbed, really throughout Europe, and they spread their culture while doing so. A big reason why the Vikings did this is because at the time, the earth was colder, and especially in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, permafrost had set in to make it very difficult to farm, and therefore they used that as an excuse to steal other people's food instead of just moving south themselves. One famous Viking, his name was Leif Erikson, and he even spread Viking culture as far as Canada around the year 1000 AD. So that means that Christopher Columbus was not actually the first European to set foot in the Americas. Now, Christopher Columbus was much more important because he led to a lasting contact with Native Americans. But Leif Erikson basically went to Canada, stayed there for about a year, then came back to Greenland and died, didn't write about it, didn't tell many people about it, and so people did not follow him. Okay, so that's why Christopher Columbus, several centuries later, made a much bigger impact, even though Leif Erikson was indeed first. The Kievan Rus existed in modern-day Russia, this area right here in the red. It existed from 882 to 1240, and it was a loose federation of Eastern European city-states. We've seen city-states before in ancient Mesopotamia, in ancient Greece, and they existed in the Kievan Rus as well. And it existed north of the Byzantine Empire in what is today Russia. Also from 600 to 1200, Europe was behind both China and the Islamic world technologically and militarily. So we've all lived in a world where Europe and America has been very prosperous compared to Asia and Africa and Latin America for our entire lives. It's always been much richer, much more technologically advanced. But that was not the case in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the areas of the world that were more technologically advanced were China and the Abbasid caliphate. So this would change dramatically in the 1400s. The 1400s, with the Renaissance and the Reformation, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, that is what really made Europe permanently dominant on the world stage. Postclassical Africa. The phrase sub-Saharan Africa, that is the bulk of Africa that is south of the Sahara Desert. So looking on the map here, the Sahara Desert covers basically the northern third of the African continent. Very few people live here. They live along the coast up here, but not in the actual desert just south of the coast. And sub-Saharan Africa means everything south of the Sahara. And from 600 to 1200, Africans mostly lived in kinship groups, clans, and tribes, not really nations and empires like we've seen in Asia and Europe. So if you look at the map there, it looks pretty sparse, and not just because it was sparsely populated. There were a lot of people living in Africa, but there weren't many civilizations that were centralized. There were small kingdoms here and there, for example, Ghana and Great Zimbabwe, but most of Africa, all that area in the gray, was tribal land. It was not an organized empire or nation, didn't have borders like we see today, but people lived in kinship groups, in clans, and in tribes. And though largely stateless, Africa did participate in trade, both across the Sahara Desert in this trade route, as well as in the Indian Ocean, which you see in Eastern Africa here. Muslim merchants spread Islam to much of Africa, but Christianity and animism, which is the belief that inanimate objects in nature have souls, those remained dominant in other parts of the continent. For example, Christianity remained dominant in Ethiopia, which is this region right here, and animism, tribal religions, remained dominant in most of the rest of the continent. Then we get to the post-classical American civilization. So what was happening on the other side of the ocean? Well, the Mayans, which we recently talked about, they had declined by about 900 AD, didn't really exist anymore, but two other large civilizations developed in the Americas during the post-classical era. The first being the Mississippian civilization. The Mississippian civilization formed along the Mississippi River. Here's a map of the modern-day U.S. here, and all of these plots on the map, those are places where cities of the Mississippian civilization existed, the largest of which, right here, just right outside of St. Louis, Missouri, on the other side of the river in Illinois, is called Cahokia. And this was a massive mound. So the Mississippian civilization built these huge mounds, these earthen hills, the largest of which was Cahokia, and those were the centers of their cities. In fact, at one point, Cahokia had even more people living there than London. Then the second group in this region and era was the Toltecs. The Toltecs formed in Mexico after the Mayans declined. So the Toltecs were in between the time of the Mayans and the time of the Aztecs, who we'll talk about later. And their religion was both polytheistic and animistic, and they later very much influenced the Aztecs. Last slide here, the world in 1200. As we get up to 1200, the start of the modern era in the AP World History curriculum, where are we? Well, in 1200, Christian Europe and the Islamic Middle East were embroiled in a series of wars called the Crusades. And the Crusades were mostly fought over the Holy Land. The Holy Land is mostly modern-day Israel, the region where Jesus lived and walked and taught and died on the cross and claimed to have risen from the dead. And so it's a place that's very holy to Christians. It's also a place that's very holy to Jews, since that's where Abraham traveled to. That's where King David ruled. And it's also sacred to Muslims, because Jerusalem is the city where Muslims believe that Muhammad ascended into heaven at the end of his life in 632. So it's an area with great religious significance to multiple different religions, and there were a series of wars fought over control of the Holy Land. Basically, this started when the Muslims conquered the Holy Land and then stopped allowing Christians and Jews to make pilgrimages there or religious journeys to see the sites of their holy figures. And because of that, the Pope in 1095 called for a crusade, and this became known as the First Crusade. And that was actually a really big success. After the First Crusade, the Christians won. They took over Jerusalem and Israel, and they controlled the Holy Land for about a century. But then Muslims reconquered Jerusalem, and war continued between Christians and Muslims all the way up until the 1500s. There were a lot of different crusades after the first one in different parts of the Islamic and Christian world. The Crusades weakened both Europe and the Abbasid Caliphate. It really caused the Abbasid Caliphate to decline, and it caused Europe to weaken as well. Africa was mostly stateless at this point in the year 1200, and that would remain for a little while longer. Song China was the largest and strongest nation on earth. So looking at this part of Afro-Eurasia here, Song China was very dominant. About 40% of the world's population lived within Song China. And the three trade routes of the Silk Road right here, the Indian Ocean trade, and the Trans-Saharan trade continued to connect all of Afro-Eurasia, but the Americas were still very much isolated from all of Afro-Eurasia and developing in isolation.